Ardent followers of Manx politics will undoubtedly have been both fascinated and enthralled by last week's momentous political events. While the departure of now former Treasury Minister David Ashford seemed inevitable, the Chief Minister's Tynwald statement was extensive in policy announcements but rather light in terms of directly addressing the findings of the Industrial Tribunal. After taking some time to recover from last week's excitement, Alastair Ramsay tries to make sense of these dramatic events with me, Phil Gaughan.
Yes, indeed, one of those kind of apparent crises that produce a strong response and many bold statements about change and fundamental reform, which I'm not entirely convinced by.
And of course, the difficulty the Chief Minister had with his statement to Tynwald, emergency statement in relation to the DHSC versus Rosalind Ranson, was this is an ongoing matter. So there's still at least 3 lines of inquiry to pursue. Yeah. So it's difficult for politicians to say an awful lot at this stage, isn't it?
Yeah, I think what he was doing was responding to a very considerable public concern and shock and outrage over what people had read in that report. So he needed to make a strong sounding response, which he did. So in that sense, they kind of read the public mood. They were ahead of it. What struck me about it was how wide ranging the response was. All sorts of measures that weren't necessarily relevant to this particular case, just throwing the kitchen sink at it, a real kind of scattergun, and setting all sorts of hairs running. Many of those hairs from the island plan. And what I might have expected to happen is that there would be a second stage where you just look at the implications of this case for government a bit more precisely, what went wrong, what failed, who failed. And then once you've got a more targeted approach, proceed on that basis. But they've gone for this very broad kind of blunderbuss response.
And that was probably in there. Hidden amongst a whole load of other bold statements. I mean, another one that really surprised me was that the SAVE programme is back on the table. I mean, this was the infamous SAVE programme, which it is alleged cost more than it actually saved.
I think it produced a few recommendations for reform and streamlining, but he's also revived the single legal entity, bringing in non-ministerial executive advisors from the private sector. I can't see how that fits into an issue about kind of public sector governance. I would have thought that wasn't the solution at all. So it was a very broad, almost too broad approach.
A few interesting omissions, I thought, from the Chief Minister's statement. So one was an acknowledgement that the Chief Secretary had decided to bring forward his retirement with immediate effect. No praise for or thanks for the hard work of the Chief Secretary over the 12 years he's been in that role. Just an acknowledgement that he was going. It's quite unusual, and of course rumours are flying around the corridors of power that maybe the imminent retirement was set to avoid some other form of removal from his post.
Yeah, I think there was an acknowledgement of the Chief Secretary's service in the statement that was issued the previous day, but the timing of that announcement can only lead to people being suspicious and speculation and so on, which is unfortunate. But there is a pattern in these situations of chief officers departing in the midst of controversy. Over the last 3 years, there have been 3 other chief officers and now the very head of the civil service going. And I think that kind of underlines the impression that it's the civil servants who are responsible for everything. They run everything. And so when people talk about accountability, they're really meaning about how do we make civil servants accountable? And that, to me, is sidestepping the ultimate political responsibility for what happens in government.
And again, that it wasn't so much in the statement, but the questioning on the statement. The Chief Minister was given the opportunity, a very clear question from, I think it was Claire Christian, MHK. Do you have confidence in the Treasury Minister, who was the Health Minister at the time of all these issues? And do you have confidence in Dr. Henrietta Ewart? And the Chief Minister then took us on a journey which didn't address either of those two points.
He failed to answer those, and he reverted to a Johnsonian, we must get on with the job kind of response.
And that, again, it's possible that we're reading too much into this, because on the one hand, the last thing any football manager needs is confidence from the chairman of the board in advance of him being sacked. So to a certain extent, I can see why maybe the Chief Minister would have wanted to avoid saying, yes, I have full confidence in whoever it may be. But it was surprising that there was, it was fairly low key. There wasn't actually David Ashford is doing a brilliant job for us, and it was that
was quite skillful. I mean, I was pleasantly surprised at the robust challenging from the backbenchers, that people were prepared to ask those sorts of questions, and in some cases say that the minister should do the right thing and go, and that was kind of reassuring, because you always worry that the backbenchers are a bit supine sometimes, but they, again, responded to the public mood, I think. And
again, this goes back to the often used charge that Peter Carron used to fire out about cronyism and clubby, matey, and all the Peter Carron catchphrases that would appear from time to time. And of course, the issue there is that if backbenchers are seen to be being obstreperous and calling for the heads of ministers and this and that, the Chief Minister has it in his gift to appoint them to certain roles and certain positions. And anyone who's in politics who doesn't have ambition to be in positions of power may be in politics for the wrong reasons, because actually if you want to achieve anything, you need to be in positions of power. So you can kind of understand why some politicians might have been reticent in coming forward. But now that we have the new payment structure, you're going to get your equivalent of what backbenchers would have had, assuming that they took on departmental roles. That they get that anyway. So they're not as beholden onto government as they were.
There isn't the financial incentive anymore, but I think most members would still want to get in there and do stuff and be seen to be doing stuff, and that's fair enough. But also maybe there's a recognition that the challenging, scrutinising part of the job is equally important in terms of the functioning of the Parliament, and maybe there's a growing recognition of that.
Yes, and as you say, it was certainly encouraging to hear, because again, I think sometimes ministers get very upset and take these things rather too personally. Yeah. Actually, the role of someone who's not a minister, if nothing else, is to scrutinise the work of government, and that's effectively what we elect our politicians to do, to come up with good ideas and make sure that the government is being properly held to account.
And to ask those questions that the public would ask if they were in there, the obvious questions, and see what the response is, test out the positions.
Yeah. So in terms of the announcements, from what we could gather, I mean, there were so many announcements from the Chief Minister, but the surprise, I suppose, is that there would be no further statement from the Chief Minister with regards to the Chief Secretary's position until I think it was either October or November, which kind of implies that there's going to be an interim Chief Secretary until October, November time, when the Chief Minister finally reports back to Tynwald and explains what the new strategy is going to be.
Yes, but they said that they were going to review the role of Chief Secretary, so I suppose they can't appoint until they've decided what that role is. And that's part of the whole reconsidering everything. Another of my worries is this is a huge amount of work that requires a great deal of expertise and knowledge of government. Who's actually going to do it? Are they going to bring people in from outside? Are they going to give it to some civil servants who are already there? Will people trust the work of an existing civil servant because they're all apparently contaminated by this one episode? I'm not sure that they had time to think this through, and under the pressure of the public mood, the timescale of Tynwald, I think this has been a kind of half thought out response, and a lot of the thinking through has got to happen yet, I think. And
yet, anyone with half a degree of sense would have known that this was coming. The evidence that as it was being given to the tribunal, the various conclusions that were being reached, the statements that were being made by particularly Dr. Ranson's representatives, talking about fabrication of evidence, for goodness sakes. It's obviously been coming. So you'd like to think that Council of Ministers will have been thinking about this for probably a month or more before the actual result of the inquiry was brought forward.
But I don't know about your recollections, but in my time in government, the number of times we were surprised by the inevitable was itself surprising.
Yes, whenever there was the various conspiracy theories flying around the social media and the press, the comment that was often made in Council of Ministers, if only we were that good.
Yes, cock up beats conspiracy every time.
Absolutely, yeah. Certainly the Chief Minister, when he was elected to the role, I think there was a fair amount of optimism that things were going to change. I have to say I've been mildly critical over the last 2 or 3 months that there hasn't been very much evidence of that change. And indeed, we talk about emergencies. There's climate emergencies. We've got this cost of living crisis, you could reasonably say. The housing crisis that was talked about so much, it didn't appear as though there was an awful lot happening. So maybe there has been a lot of work going on behind the scenes, and maybe this is possibly announcing some of the things that were about to happen, maybe announcing them a little bit earlier than they'd intended.
Yeah, I think it's been an opportunity for them to accelerate some aspects of the island plan that weren't getting much attention. Things like the single legal entity, that's not exactly going to get people cheering in the pubs, but it might be relevant to this issue in terms of the command structures and the centralisation of government generally. But
because I think most people would reasonably assume that the Isle of Man government already is a single entity, but that's not the case, is it?
No. The departments are individual legal entities, but we're told that there's no such thing, legally speaking, as the Isle of Man government. Now, this project to make it one government in law was all the rage a few years ago. 1 or 2 members were very keen on it, and as they have disappeared, then the appetite for it has diminished, I think. And it's been very much on the back burner, but this has brought it back for the time being.
You're listening to political commentator Alastair Ramsay on Agenda with me, Phil Gaughan.
This was going to be a centrepiece of the new regime.
Yeah.
That these plans and debating these plans was going to be a form of scrutiny and help clarify the direction of government. But inevitably, they are bureaucratic descriptions of the department. And the Treasury Department plan didn't even include many of its more interesting policy initiatives because it was just a description of the department of the sort that used to be published.
Yeah, and it's hard to know what the point of all this is. I mean, I suppose I can just about understand from economic development's point of view that it's handy to have a nice little glossy brochure to hand out to people who are coming to the island, who wish to invest in the island, businesses who are already on the island even, that want to find out more about the department and how it can help. But in terms of any sort of meaningful political debate, you would have thought that the meaningful political debate in relation to the economic development of the enterprise department, isn't it? You would have thought that the debate would have been on, are we doing enough to reinvigorate the Manx economy? Surely that's the starting point.
Yeah, I think in fairness to that particular department, the economic strategy is a separate piece of work, and that we're promised that before the summer, I think. That's the KPMG report. But no, I think there is a danger, I think, with this administration, that they are kind of, rather like the response to the Ranson affair, throwing too much at it, overcomplicating it, all sorts of new committees. This creates a great impression of activity and change and what have you, but some of it is moving the furniture, I think.
Because, it is reasonable. Certainly most members of the public would probably say or conclude that we are over-governed. There's too much government happening on the island. So is that a fair estimation, or is that one of those political myths that's quite popular on the doorstep but hard to justify when you actually try and pare down what government does?
Yeah, I mean, that was certainly the view of the scope and structure exercise years ago, and maybe that kind of theme is being revived now, that government does too much in the Isle of Man. But that exercise was quite political. It came at it from a quite conservative, small government, low tax kind of perspective. But one of the public view is that we've got too many politicians. For example, on some local authorities, they've reduced the number of members. I think that's quite a superficial kind of gesture, really, because you actually need enough politicians to have the scrutiny. If you really reduce the number of members of the House of Keys down to 12, for example, you'd basically be no difference between the government and the Parliament.
And of course, the important thing to remember about this is an inevitability of someone who's spent some years as a parliamentarian on the island, a member of Tynwald. You've got to remember that Westminster has something like almost 700 MPs. The Isle of Man, we have 24 directly elected members of our Parliament, of the House of Keys. And we do pretty much, well, you'd probably say 70 to 80% of the legislative work that happens in the UK's Parliament happens in the Manx Parliament. So, there's a relatively, a significantly smaller set of eyes to read through all our legislation compared with that in the UK.
And it's one of the great challenges for the island generally, is that we are trying to sustain a fully functioning national government with a kind of local authority political culture, small local authority resources in terms of finance, and actual people resources as well. And so that's quite a trick to pull off.
You would imagine that there are some obvious areas that we shouldn't be doing if this general belief is correct that governments become too big. So where are these obvious areas that we need to, or government needs to do less government in? I'm
not sure. I'm not entirely convinced by that kind of privatise everything or the arm's length. I mean, they're trying arm's length in a big way with Manx Care. That has turned out to be quite an expensive option, and I'm not sure that aspect was identified at the time they made the decision. So again, I'm not sure how well that was thought through. But again, because the Isle of Man is a very democratic place in terms of the politicians being close to the people, the politicians respond, the people want them to do more, the politicians want to be able to keep their hands on stuff, because interfering in the business of government is what gets people re-elected. And it's hard for an MHK to say, I'm sorry, it's nothing to do with me, that your road is in an unsatisfactory state, or that your auntie has waited too long for her operation. So it's something about the political culture that leads to that expansion of what government does.
And interesting, the private sector is often churned out as what we should do is follow private sector models. Well, there are some advantages to that, and the obvious thing that the private sector does is lives and dies on the marketability of its product. If its product is good, people will buy it, and the company will be successful. If its product isn't good, then quite frankly, the company doesn't have a long-term viability. It's a bit different to that in government, and certainly the area that I think we do far too much of in government, certainly when I was in government, I felt we did too much of, was the internal scrutiny. So everything that you do is, first of all, scrutinised by the 86,000 stakeholders that we have, all of whom feel that they know more about the subject than the professionals who are paid to deal with the topic. So because of that level of scrutiny and that level of feeling that actually we have a right to know and we have a right to say things about how our government is run, that's the bit, the engagement, the public engagement bit, the making sure, double and triple and quadruple checking everything to make sure that there's nothing could possibly go wrong. In terms of capital projects, we don't just double protect our projects, we triple and quadruple protect to make sure that we've thought about every possible contingency and every possible thing that could possibly go wrong.
And they still go wrong.
But at least, because the budgets are so overblown, generally speaking, government gets away with it. But this is what adds on to the cost of government, is this kind of internal scrutiny, the blame culture in government. And I'm not wholly sure how the private sector would be able to come in and manage to help politicians remove that.
I guess they could say what they would do in a private organisation, but these are not private organisations, and private companies have a discipline about the bottom line and a focus and a direction and a sense of priorities that's driven by the market, and that's what the government lacks. And in the Isle of Man, it's even more kind of loose, because there is no clear mandate for an incoming government. There is no direction given by the public that says these are the priorities, get on with it. So actually you do need to stop at every step and say, is this what you want, guys? Because there isn't that outcome from the election process to give you a steer.
I suggested to Daphne Kane, MHK, I think it was on last week's agenda, that maybe it's time for a committee to look into the most efficient and effective governments in the world and report back to Tynwald. Let's look to see who's doing the most efficient forms of government, which governments are actually managing to chime in with public mood and deliver the things that the people appear to want. Where are people most happy with their governments? Maybe we need to do a bit of research. Maybe we should do some agendas on that.
North Korea, because there's a trade-off between effectiveness and efficiency and democracy, and I guess your government has to fit the culture of the place. And if we had a ruthless, highly efficient, effective government here, people wouldn't like it. It's not the Manx way.
Plenty to consider there, and I hope that Alastair Ramsay helped shed some light on the often opaque world of politics. The Chief Minister has certainly been set a challenge by recent events, so do you think he's responded well? Please get in touch with Phil Gaughan at manxradio.com and let me know your thoughts and views on the programme. You can access the podcast of this week's agenda from Manx Radio's website. But for now, I'm Phil Gaughan. Goramayo. Thanks for listening.